Okay, so I think I can get so yeah, today we will be learning about the ecosystems. So get straight to it. Let's first look at some vocabulary words. This will revolve around most of the competition in ecosystems. So today we will learn about two main parts. The first part is the competition in ecosystem, and the second part is about energy transfer within the ecosystem. But let's get started about what ecosystem is. So, an ecosystem is a community of interacting organisms and their environment, and this includes both living and non-living things. So you can think of ecosystem as a whole system. So if you know what a system is, systems have parts operating as a whole. So you have these multiple organisms, living things and non-living things that are parts of a whole. So they all work together to make the ecosystem. You can see on the picture on the top, these are two separate types of ecosystems. The one on the left is a savanna, and you can see organisms like this elephant. It's also trees, grass, and there are also non-living things like soil, rocks, and wait more. On the right, this is also an ecosystem because although it is underwater, there is still a community of organisms. So you can see that there are these corals, these many fishes of variety of species, and there are also larger fishes, maybe like a shark, in this ecosystem. So you can see how there's a whole system of organisms interacting with each other. But we can't leave out the part of competition because that is the main part we will focus today. So if there's an ecosystem, there will be competition. This means that the relationship between organisms that strive for the same resources in the same ecosystem. So we will learn about how there is limited amount of supplies in each ecosystem and how organisms need to compete for those resources. Next is the environmental factors. So in competition, we will learn that there are multiple factors that can affect the amount of competition happening, one of which is the environmental factors. And they're the things in one's surroundings, including living and non-living things. So environmental factors are everything in the environment or everything around us. On the other hand, the other factor, genetic factors, you can see here, are traits that are inherited from one's parents, such as our hair color, eye color, and height. It's something we inherit from our parents. So it's passed down by generations and it's not affected by the environment. It is something that you were born with. The next vocabulary word is invasive species. We will also learn about invasive species, which are plants or animals that are not native to a given area. So these are vocabulary words of the first part that we will learn today. So yeah, I'll give you time to write it down if you want to, but let's see. Yeah, is everyone finished with writing this slide? Um, okay. Okay, so we are done writing it down. Let's take a look at this video, and this will be the first one out of the two that we will be watching today. So this is again about the competitions in ecosystems. So you will learn about that in this video. So that was the video about competitions in ecosystems. And I have prepared a second part. Um, this is more about the food web and how energy is transferred from organisms to organisms. So, a really good way to show that is by a food chain, and it is a simple diagram to show how energy moves from one living thing to another. And this food chain can be expanded to become a food web. And that is a model that shows us how matter cycles and energy flows in an ecosystem through the mixing of the food chains. So the food web is basically, you will see in the later couple slides, but it has multiple paths um, leading from a certain organisms to another. And it shows the predation of the other. So it is a really good way to see how energy is transferred from organisms to organisms. Then next, these three are all are just parts of the food chain. Um, you will learn that there are primary producers, which is at the top. Um, if you look at it in an energy chain, it will look at the bottom, but it's the living thing that produces its own food. So producers are often plants that can produce their own food from the sunlight. And the next steps are couple consumers. So there are different levels of consumers as well. We will see in the video, but they are the living things that eats other living things. They will eat either the producers or other consumers. We will also learn that there are decomposers in the food chain, and they are a group of living things that break down dead organisms. Because if producers and consumers die, um, their waste needs to be cleared up, and the decomposers take the job to do that. And all of these you will see are working really close together to sustain the ecosystem. are you finished with writing it down or just need a bit?
Oh, oh,
Yeah, so I think we need to move on. If you don't finish writing it, it's okay. Since this is pretty lengthy explanation, but you'll get a more sense if we look at this video. It's the second part, and this will discuss the food web general and how there is a cycling of matter and energy throughout the ecosystem. So that was the video about the food webs, and we learned about the cycling of matter and the flow of energy. So yeah, this will be like a quick recap, and we will focus specifically on well on both topics that we've covered today. Let's begin with what an ecosystem is. So, to review, an ecosystem is a community of living things and non-living things that interact with each other in a particular area. And for these slides, you guys don't need to write it down, um, because it's most of the concepts that um, we have seen in the video. So there are two types of ecosystems. Um, Well, there are two main categories of ecosystems, and they are terrestrial and aquatic. Terrestrial, which means land ecosystems, are, for example, like forest. Like trees give oxygen and shelter to animals. Animals eat plants, other animals, and fungi break down dead things and return nutrients to the soil. That is all happening on land, and that is just of one category the ecosystem. But remember how ecosystems also exist underwater, and they are called the aquatic ecosystems, which means it's happening in water or near it. So in coral reefs, fish, corals, and other sea creatures live together. For example, corals shelter, fish finds food, and the predators keep the balance. And of course, these are two main overarching categories, but there are multiple categories even within these um, two. So, for example, in land ecosystems, it's not just a forest. You'll see that there's also the savanna, or like maybe a rainforest, um, and other types of land. So it's not just a forest that exists in terrestrial ecosystems. And the same applies to the aquatic ecosystems as well. So, of course, in an ecosystem cannot sustain itself without competitions. And that's because there are limited materials in each ecosystems and organisms need to compete for their food. It's not just the food, as they compete for almost everything. So, like air, water, food, sunlight, and space for their shelter, for their place to live. And these competitions help balance the ecosystem and make it healthier as competitions help cycle the ecosystem as a whole. So you can see kind of the bears competing each other. We usually think about competitions in terms of humans, like we compete for things to get certain materials to win a game. But competitions in ecosystems are like life and death situation as they compete for what they need to live. So you can imagine how fierce these competitions are and how they will do whatever they can to get the materials that they need. So there are multiple factors we've seen in the first video that affect competition. So we saw about the environmental factors and genetic factors. And environmental factors are things in nature that make it easier or harder for living things to survive and compete for resources. So the resource itself can be an environmental factor because not every ecosystem has the same amount of resources. Maybe one ecosystem might have more resources to work with, while the other one has a small amount. Um, the other part is the temperature and climate and the terrain, just all kind of linked together because that depends on the location of the ecosystem, where it is on Earth. If if it rains often, for example, in the rainforest I've seen here, and if it's really dry and um, there's barely any rain in the savanna, it's if it's really cold or if it's like underwater, it might have a different effect on the ecosystem because the whole ecosystem is underwater. You can see how all these environmental factors can affect the competitions. It kind of chooses what they will do. Um, Environmental factors usually are the things that organisms cannot control themselves. Um, so that is why they have to adapt to the environment because there are various environmental factors that play during competition. When they adapt, um, it's a good link way to our next factor, which is the genetic factors. So they are inherited factors that affect competition by influencing how well an organism survives and reproduces. So genetic factors are different from environmental factors that it is inherited from our parents, from an organism's parents, and that usually happens when the organism adapts to the environment. It's something called the natural selection, which I believe we will learn in future topics, but to give a short overview, um, that organisms can um, develop certain areas of strength and speed to better hunt down other animals, for example, and they can develop camouflage as a part of a genetic factor, um, meaning that they can blend into the environment. You can see the chameleon here on the right. It blends in with the leaves, and other factors like body shapes and resistance have to do with the genetic factors that can affect competition as well. Quickly moving on to the next part, which had to do with the energy passing on from within the ecosystem. So this is on the second part, the second video that we watched. And energy and matter moves through an ecosystem as living things eat, grow, and break down. Remember how our body systems help us do that? I think that was a few weeks ago. about remember how we learned about different human body systems, like we learned about the digestive system and the circulatory system. So all of these work together to help maintain the ecosystem as a whole as they break down using those systems. And energy flows from one organism to another, while matter is recycled and used again in different forms. So we've also learned, I believe, last week about energy transfer and how we've learned that energy is neither created nor destroyed, so it has to go somewhere. So we will learn here before we move on to actually the specific parts of the food chain. This is kind of like showing how everything is interconnected, how everything we have learned is connected. So um, we have learned that, of course, it's everything starts from the sun, and as the light reaches plants, the plant is photosynthesis. We will learn about photosynthesis in later topics as well. Just know that the plants convert the energy from the light of the sun and carbon dioxide and water to create their own food. And of course, that food is passed down to either us humans or other organisms that eat these producers. And we have learned a couple weeks ago about the human body systems, like the digestive system and the circulatory system. And although these pictures are just for human digestive tracts and circulatory system, remember how multiple organisms have different types of digestive systems, and they have different type of circulatory system. But you can see how all of these are working together. So we consume, for example, the plants, and then it goes down the esophagus, and then goes into the stomach, where it's broken down, and then it goes into the small intestines, and then through the large intestines out of our body. So we can see kind of all these working together, and from the nutrients that were absorbed in the small intestines, it is passed on to the circulatory system. We learned last time that circulatory system helps deliver oxygen and nutrients through the rest of our body. And after we consume it, it's passed down through the circulatory system to the cells, to each cells in all parts of our body. And in those cells, the video also talked about cellular respiration. We will also learn about that in a separate day because there's a separate topic about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But just know for now that cellular respiration is a process that we take in nutrients and break it down into um, energy that we use. So you can see how energy is constantly being transferred from the sun to the plants to the animals and to another animal. This is the process that animals and plants go through as they pass down energy. And a really, really good way to show this is by food chains and food webs. So we can map the path of energy transfer between organisms using food chains and food webs. So see on the left that this is an example of a food chain. So you can see the numbers, the first the plants, and then the crickets, and then to the mouse, then to the snake, and then to the eagle. And after the eagle, maybe when it dies, we saw how decomposers break it down and return it to the soil. So you can see the cycle happening with this simple food chain. This whole diagram is a food chain. And on the right, this is an example of a food web. So you can see it's much more complex than the food chain as it has multiple paths. I talked about how food web is an interacting food chain. You can see green plants can go to rabbits, it can also go to goats, and it can also go to mouse. And rabbits can be eaten by wild cats or these jackals. You can see multiple arrows that are um, extending off of the organisms, meaning that those um, predated, meaning that they hunt down the other organisms. So you can see multiple paths that it can take. And you can observe that easily with a food web. These are parts of the food chain, the food web. So remember how all energy comes from the sun, and then it's passed down to producers, like primary producers, like plants. They're at the bottom of the chain, which creates their own food from the sun. And then it goes to the primary consumers. They consume producers to get their energy. They're also called herbivores because they only eat plants. Now that energy goes to secondary consumers. And secondary consumers consume herbivores and or producers so that they can be carnivores, meaning eat meat, and or omnivores, meaning that they both eat meat and plants. There's also another level of consumer called the tertiary consumers, which is above the secondary consumers, and they consume the secondary consumers. You can see how, as the steps go by, the consumers after it takes in the other consumers. And finally, after the tertiary consumers die, decomposers break down these dead plants and animals and they return it to the soil. So just remember these steps from the sun to the producers to the consumers and to the decomposers. And remember how we've also talked about some energy is lost. So not all energy is passed down 100% of the time. Some energy is lost as heat or is used in parts that are not consumed by other organisms. So for example, here, J, you can see here, is called joules, and joules is a measure of energy. You can see that there is 1 million joules of sunlight. But you can see in the plants that they only have 10,000 joules, which means that they only took 1% from the sunlight to make their energy. So it's very energy inefficient because they only make 1% of the energy from the sunlight. And as it goes down from organisms to organisms, from consumers to consumers, you can see that when the crickets, for example, eat the plants, they only have 1,000 joules, which is the 10% of 10,000 joules. And if it goes down to like rodents or rats, they only have 100 joules, again, reduced by 10%. And finally, when it gets to tertiary consumers, for example, like humans are also tertiary consumers, we only get 10 joules of energy. That's also 10% of 100 joules. You can see how this is very inefficient and how a lot of energy is lost, most of the time as heat, because, of course, says humans and organisms need heat to sustain ourselves. You can see with this food web, you can better explain how competition works and how ecosystems sustain itself. So for example, you can see this mouse over here. There's a mouse. A mouse can be eaten by the owl or the hawk or the fox. So you can see a dramatic change if mouse goes extinct. So for example, if all the mouse in this ecosystem dies out, which means that owls, uh, foxes, and hawks would have reduced amounts of resources for them to eat. So, and also, if the mouse dies out, that means the owls and the hawks and the foxes population will decrease. Because see how mouse is consumed by them. But if mouse dies out, you can see how the grasses population will increase. This population will increase. You guys see why? It's because when the mouse dies out, since they eat the grass, if there is nothing to eat the grass, then it'll be overpopulated with grass. So you can see the amount of grass increasing. You can see how only by removing a single species within this food web can create a dramatic change in the ecosystem as a whole. That is what I wanted to focus for this slide. And one last thing I want to talk about is the invasive species. So invasive species are organisms that are not native to an ecosystem. They're usually, invasive species are carried to different ecosystems by us humans, maybe for um, purposes for ourselves. But remember how invasive species can ruin the competition system in an ecosystem by dominating other species. For example, you can see on the left, a human introduced this giant snake. And what will that do to this happy little ecosystem? If a snake is introduced, then it will most likely eat other organisms like this frog, these ducks. All of them will be eaten by the snake. And remember how even if one species goes extinct, the change is huge. So you can see that these snakes will eat all the ducks, and without the ducks, it'll create many changes that can ruin the ecosystem. And you can see how dangerous invasive species can be. Now, about the careers. Okay, so this is also like an important last part of our lecture. And I'd like to end off with the related careers. So for example, you can become an ecologist. So if you become an ecologist, then you study how organisms interact with each other and their environment. If you want to be an ecologist, then you would need to look at food webs and how energy moves through the ecosystems. So you can see how the concepts that we learned today are connected to the careers that we can have in the future. We also talked about wildlife biologists. They study animal populations and how they fit into ecosystems. They need to examine energy flow and food chains within habitats. Another career that you can take by using this topic is the environmental scientist. They assess how human activities impact ecosystems. They work to protect food webs and maintain energy balance in nature. Finally, you can also become a marine biologist. They study marine ecosystems and food webs in oceans. Maybe you like the ocean more than the land, so you would like to become a marine biologist. Then you can do that, but you remember how they need to research how energy flows through aquatic environments. So all the important concepts that we learned today will be useful in later careers. And there are way more careers you can take with this related topic. This is a very important topic that will lead you most likely to the field of ecology or biology. Yeah, this is the end of today's lecture. And do you guys have any questions to ask me? I can explain more parts about something, or yeah, do you guys have any questions? Yeah, if you have a question, you can um come up and ask me. Yeah.
Any person, maybe this action, if you have any question. Um, you don't have any question. So you understand everything. Yeah. All right. Huh? Yes, Jamie. Hello.
Hello?
Hello, Jamie. Yeah. They said they understand everything. So I think you can ask them questions now.
Oh, okay, so they want me to ask the questions. Okay. Okay. Sure, I can do that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I know. He's going to ask you guys questions. And I'm going to point those in the answer. So get ready. Hey, you.
So,
Hello.
yes, so I sharing the screen now. So, yeah, let's try this question. So, what are the different components of an ecosystem? Can anyone just name a few components? So, what is there in an ecosystem?
Different components. What are the
Maybe something like plants, something like animals, and yeah, so basically in an ecosystem, there are living and non-living components. So living things like animals, plants, and doing more, and non-living things like their environment, like water, air, rocks, soil, and yeah, those are non-living components that are all parts of the ecosystem. And maybe I'll try this next question. So, how can an organism's genetic traits affect its ability to survive? Remember how we saw birds with longer beaks? So maybe birds with longer beaks compared to birds with shorter beaks. Maybe they can reach other bugs better. So maybe we have the bug over here, the bug over here. You can see how genetic traits can affect the ability to survive because this bird can get the bug, but this bird cannot get the bird. So um this bird this species of bird will survive because they can reach um other bugs way more efficiently, while this bird is um disadvantaged because they cannot reach the bugs as well as these birds. So you can see how genetic factors can affect the abilities for an organism to survive. And
Yeah.
um, in that lesson, we will talk about electric and magnetic fields. So, and on that day, it's
That is
possible.
the topic.
The topic is electric and magnetic fields for that day. And
Hello, David.
hello?
Yeah, David.
Yes.
Yeah, what will be the topic for the 2 weeks?
Yes, we will be meeting in 2 weeks because next week, you guys have a field trip, right? And
The, I think the next 2 weeks is the 7th of March. The next 2 weeks is 7th of March, which might be probably a holiday. Yeah, the 7th month is not to be a holiday. That's why which is not which is
all right, you speak a little bit louder, please. I can't hear you properly.
Yes, you talk that.
So it's true that there's no class the next week, right?
Continue then.
Yeah, so
So then, okay.
okay, we will meet on the 7th then, and on that day, it's possible that someone else will be presenting, but I will let you know that day if someone else is doing or yeah. And I will also be joining the meeting. So
Okay, okay. All right.
okay. So yeah, I'll see all of you on March 7th. Okay, yeah. Bye.
Okay.